Hey everybody, how you doing? Um, Hopefully you've had some time to think about our fun trip that we did and everything you've learned. And now it's had time to marinate in your mind a little bit. So now I want to kind of add to that discussion by giving you an overall summary of the geologic history of the region we visited, as well as answer a lot of the questions that you've had. I've really enjoyed reading your questions as they've been coming in. You have great questions. Keep asking them. I love them. So I'm going to try to do this in one take. So we'll see how it goes. I created some slides to help incorporate some visual aids. And I don't know how long this is going to take, but I think there's some cool things that you can learn from this. All right, so let me share my screen. All right, so Geology of Southwest Utah summary. So I've split what we encountered into four basic steps. We have step one, deposition of the sedimentary layers. Step two, uplift of existing rock. Step three, erosion by river incision. Step four, recent volcanism. So we can simplify it to this level, but obviously each of these steps has more complexity and sub-steps, and I think deserves some sort of discussion to it. So I'm going to take a little bit of time discussing each of these steps so you can get an understanding of how it works and how it relates to what we encountered on our field trip. All right, so step one, deposition of sedimentary layers. So there wasn't just one layer that we saw. If you're thinking about when we drove up Kolob Terrace Road to that portion of Zion, we saw the big cliff forming layer, which is the Navajo sandstone, and then we had the slope at the bottom, which is the Kayenta formation. On the way up and the way down, we saw these other slope forming layers. Each of these is basically a record or a representation of the existing environment at the time it was deposited, okay? So I have here all these layers listed out with their respective depositional settings, and we can see that the setting changed a lot over time. Within this rock package, within these layers, we're dealing with about 100 million years of history that's recorded. 100 million years, that's a decent amount of time. That's a lot of time for things to change. The climate can change, the elevation can change, the basin where the sediment is accumulating can change. So we get different properties with each of these different layers. So if we start at the base, we have the Kaibab formation or Kaibab limestone, which is full of marine fossils. This is a layer that we only really saw at the Hurricane Hill overlook as we're overlooking the Hurricane Valley. This was marine fossils, so we can kind of make an inference that this was deposited in a shallow marine setting where lots of these sea critters lived and thrived. Our next layer up, we have the Moenkopi formation, which is an arid coastline. So some of this might represent deposition above sea level and other times slightly below sea level. And we talked about how the sea level will fluctuate over time. There are these about 100,000 year cycles where sea level will go up and down. And that's, okay, so we have an arid coastline. So that's where we also get the presence of a lot of gypsum in this layer. All right, then above that, we have the Chinle formation. This formation, this layer is full of petrified wood. There are large logs. In the Dinosaur Trackway Museum, there were a few logs that the museum got because collectors basically stole them from public lands. You're only allowed to collect 25 pounds per day. And these logs, these petrified logs, were over 25 pounds. If you are interested in finding petrified wood and collecting it and taking it home to your mom, the Chinle Formation is a great place to look. This is also the layer that caps a lot of those mesas that we saw. So if you remember me talking about Hurricane Mesa, aka Flying Monkey Mesa, that flat layer at the top is part of the Chinle Formation. That is a great place to find petrified wood. So that layer was deposited in a large river system, similar to the Amazon River system, in a humid environment, hence the large trees and logs that are preserved in there. All right, next we have the Moenavi Formation, deposited in streams and lakes. And this formation includes the Whitmore Lake member, which is the layer that we are looking at in the museum where the dinosaur tracks are preserved. So obviously we have the ideal setting. The environment was fairly arid during this time. It shifted from humid to arid, meaning less available water. So the dinosaurs would congregate around these water holes. And that's why, we have so many tracks there. Okay, so next we have the Kayenta Formation, very similar to the Moenavi, streams and rivers, less lakes in the Kayenta. And then we get our Navajo sandstone. So this is the big cliff forming layer that makes up Zion National Park, the major cliffs of Zion National Park. It's also, if you're watching this video and you did the first field trip to Snow Canyon, this is what most of Snow Canyon is in. So this layer is really cool. It's basically a bunch of sand that was deposited in a large sand dune desert. This desert was actually the largest sand dune desert that ever has existed on our planet. So you can just picture the Sahara Desert and all the sand dunes there. This is like the Sahara times 3 or 4. The Sahara Desert, you basically have a layer of gravel with a layer of sand above it, layer of sand dunes above it. In the Navajo Desert, there were sand dunes stacked upon sand dunes, stacked upon sand dunes, creating basically 2,000 feet of sand. And this is a very important layer because it's very homogeneous and also resistant, which allows it to form very steep vertical cliffs, which makes for beautiful scenery, like we encountered on Kolob Terrace Road. All right, then we have the Temple Cap Formation that's just above the Navajo. Also some sand dunes in there, but these aren't part of a sand dune desert. These are coastal dunes, so like beach dunes. And then we see that there was a seaway that worked its way inland to deposit another layer of marine limestone called the Carmel Formation. We did not see either of those on either of our field trips, but they are there. They are there in this stratigraphic record. Okay, so we have 100 million years of history that is recording these changes in environment. One thing I do want to point out is if we look at the base of this sequence, we have marine, then we have shoreline, and then we have rivers, continental dunes. So there's a transition from under sea level to above sea level. So this is recording tectonic events where the North American continent is actually uplifting. So since this is uplifting, that means sea level relatively is dropping. And instead of having marine deposits, we are having continental deposits. All right, so with that, there were, of course, a lot of questions about the Moenavi Formation, dinosaur footprints, and fossil formation. So let's go to those. All right, so here's a few of your questions. So how is it that current and waves of the Whitmore Lake were able to be fossilized and preserved in the rock? Are dino tracks only possible in certain layers of rock? How can the imprint of a foot stay somewhere for that long and not get washed away? Does the climate have to change for fossils to be made also? What conditions help and make and preserve tracks the best? So we have all these questions about like, how do these things actually get preserved in the geologic record? Because you think, you're probably thinking about, well, if I walk around in the mud, I don't think my tracks are going to get preserved 200 million years later. But the truth is that if you step in the right place, your track actually can be preserved. And 200 million years in the future, there could be a fossil print of your shoe. So the way this works is using the dinosaur trackway for an example. You have the Whitmore Lake member, which is basically this shallow lake setting. And this lake was fairly silty or muddy. So when the dinosaurs were playing around in the water, they would step in the mud. Mud is a fine-grained sediment, and it's fairly cohesive. So meaning it traps the water in it. So when you make a print in it, it will keep the shape of that print. Okay, if you think about stepping in sand, the sand will kind of collapse in on itself. If you step in mud, the mud will stick to your shoe. When you take your foot out, you will see all the details of your foot around it, which is what we're seeing with those tracks. So you have the print being made. Okay. Well, what happens is this is an active depositional system. So it's not like there's just one layer of sediment and it's staying stable with that one layer forever. There's constantly sediment being put into this lake and into this system. So the dinosaur steps, moves on. The rivers that feed into this lake are constantly bringing in sediment, and that sediment will fill in that track that has been placed there. And since it's filling it in, it's actually keeping the shape of the track in place. So you have the like negative imprint, the track itself, it's filled with sediment. That way that track cannot collapse because now it's filled in. Okay. So fast forward 200 million years, this mud and the silts that filled in the track, it's been lithified. It's turned into solid rock. The grains have been cemented together. And now it's been exposed. And people were poking around the site and they saw some tracks. And they saw these tracks, especially within a specific horizon or layer within this member. And what you can do is you can peel away a layer, and it will preserve the negative print, the actual track on one side, and the infill or the positive print on the other side. So we saw that at the trackway. We saw the floor itself had the negative print, which we call the mold. And then there were certain slabs of rock that were tilted up, which would be the positive side that was removed. Okay. So going back to these questions, how are these features preserved? Ripples, tracks. The basic idea here is if the energy of this system is low enough, it will deposit material. Okay. Higher energy will remove material, lower energy will deposit material. So it was staying at an energy level where these features weren't actively eroding away. Instead, they were being added onto by additional deposition. And this is more or less what we have here. We have when the dinosaur stepped in the mud, it created a track which actually would deform or alter or squish the layers below it. And then this track was infilled by additional sediment, which, as we saw at the trackway, could actually be removed to get a slab of the actual cast fossils, cast prints. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And hopefully that answers these questions. Did the dinosaurs make any significant impacts on the geology? That trackway is probably one of the best examples on Earth of the impact that dinosaurs had on the geology. They didn't really alter depositional systems the way that other animals might, but their record of their behavior specifically is recorded there. We can see how they ran around, we can see how they swam, we can see how they sat down in the water. We can see how they pooped. Some of their poop is also preserved in that record. All right, so let's move on to the next one. Step 2, uplift. So this can actually be divided into 2 different stages. And we saw evidence of these 2 different stages on the field trip. So stage 1, we have this mountain building event, this compressional event called the severe orogeny. The word orogeny, fancy $10 word, basically means mountain building event. Okay. So this occurred around 140 to 70 million years ago. This is where I drew that picture. We had the subducting oceanic plate that caused compression on our North American plate, caused it to buckle and fold. And the result of this orogeny is we get folds and thrust faults that are occurring together. And one of these folds, one of the many, probably thousands of folds that this event created, was that virgin anticline, that rainbow in the rocks that we saw at Quail Creek. Okay. So east-west compression from converging plates caused the rocks to buckle and fold, giving us this anticline. And we saw the anticline on the north side. We could see kind of the complete fold. But if we look to the south, we saw that a lot of the anticline was eroded, with where we had the resistant layer, the Chin-Lee layer, that was dipping or sloping away from each other at both sides, and there was a valley in between. Okay, so that was stage 1. Stage 2, more recent, we have basin and range extension, which started about 23 million years ago and is still active and continuing today. This resulted in normal faults where we have uplifted ranges separated by down-dropped valleys. So I don't have my blocks in here, but the block model that I have, I pull the 2 outside blocks apart, the middle block drops down. That's more or less what we're seeing throughout this basin and range province, which exists in Western Utah. Basically where we stood at the hurricane fault was the eastern extent and goes all the way through Nevada to the eastern side of California. So basically all of Nevada and Western Utah is being stretched apart, giving us these normal faults with blocks that drop down and other blocks that elevate, giving us the Great Basin and a series of mountain ranges and down-dropped valleys. Okay. So this caused the hurricane fault, which is where we stood. Down-dropped the Hurricane Valley and uplifted this plateau feature called the Markagant Plateau, which is where Zion Canyon is. So if we look at stage 1, we had east-west compression. The region was getting compressed together and the lithosphere was thickening. You got mountain building, and that was followed by our current setting where the region is now being stretched apart in an east-west direction, giving us mountain ranges that pop up and basins that drop down. All right. So here we see on the lower right, we see a cross-sectional diagram of the hurricane fault near Cedar City, where we have all these older layers of rock. And then we have the valley next to it. So the valley has been dropped down. The layers that are existing over here, this would be the footwall block. This would be the hanging wall block. So the layers over here have been dropped clear down into the subsurface. So you have to basically drill a hole a few thousand feet down to find those layers. One thing I like about this diagram is if we look at the layers in the footwall block, we can see that they are tilted or folded. That anticline feature that we saw in Quail Creek basically extends northward into Cedar City. And what we're seeing is that there is basically 1/2 of this same anticline feature that is preserved in the footwall, but the other side has been faulted downward. So we'd have to dig down a few thousand feet to find the other half of that fold structure. Okay. So these folded rock layers were the result of the severe orogeny, but they have been dissected or superimposed by this fault, which occurred during the basin and range. All right, so let's go to some of your questions about this concept. Okay, so first one, is the stress that creates anticlines happening on a large scale or a smaller scale? So once again, this is the diagram that I drew on the board. My drawing looked a lot better than this one, though, if you're remembering right. So this is a large scale tectonic setting. This would be the North American continent. Utah would be about right here where it says fold and thrust belt. And then over here where the ocean is, that's where more or less the California coastline is. So we're seeing large scale tectonic stresses creating localized deformation to give us that Quail Creek anticline. And also the anticline that we have just east of Cedar City in the Red Hill. So if we look at this diagram, just to help us understand this a little bit better, we have a subducting oceanic plate. As this subducts, we get a bunch of sediment that's basically getting smashed together along the coastline. We have subduction and melting with a volcanic arc. So this would be occurring in California 100 million years ago. And then we see like a bunch of topography. We have a bunch of mountains forming. And these mountains are the result of compression and buckling and faulting and folding. And we have this feature called a fold and thrust belt, where we have our series of thrust faults. And along these thrust faults, we see that the sediment is folding into anticline features. So Quail Creek, the Quail Creek anticline that we saw would be one of these, to give you an idea of the scale. All right, so I love this next question. So how do you differentiate between tilted terrain as a result of a bisected anticline versus tilted terrain as a result of a chunk slipping due to tectonic rifting? So basically, if you see rocks that are rock layers that are tilted, how do you know if it's the result of compression and an anticlinal or synclinal feature, or just tilting from rifting? So in class, I gave you this example. So here we have blocks that are rotating as a result of tensional stress. So this is what we see occurring today with the hurricane fault and the basin and range. And if you notice, the layers are tilted because of the rotation of the blocks, okay? So how do you tell the difference between these tilts and tilts that you might see here or within an anticline? And that might be kind of tricky. The simple answer is, in an anticline or a syncline, you will be able to identify each limb. So it will have both sides. It will form either the rainbow or the smiley face, and you'll see both sides of it. If you see both sides, then you know that it has to be the result of compression, right? Just like the notebook example. You compress, it will fold. Whereas these, it's a single cohesive block that's rotating, so you only get one side that's tilted. There is no other side that is mirroring that. Okay. The other kind of answer to this is context and age. So if we know the age of the feature, then you can fit it into the tectonic setting. For example, if you see tilted rocks and you have constrained that tilting event to the last 20 million years, you can associate it to basin and range extension. If you think that it is older, let's say 100 million years, then you would likely associate that with the severe orogeny, that mountain building compressional event. Okay, great questions. All right, step 3, erosion by river incision. So this has happened during the last 6 million years. There's kind of a long and more complicated story to this that deals with the development of the Colorado River itself. But I'm going to simplify it a bit. And kind of like I said on the field trip, we have the hurricane normal fault that uplifted the mountainous region where the headwaters of the Virgin River are and down dropped these basins. That led to a steepening of the Virgin River and all of its tributaries. If these are steeper, the system shifts from being depositional to erosional. Okay, steeper rivers, higher energy, and that leads to incision. Okay, so that's what's being shown here. This isn't in southern Utah. This is, I actually don't know where this is. But anyway, we have mountains uplifting. And as these mountains uplift, the river responds by getting steeper and faster. And as it gets faster, it will remove sediment. It will erode and transport that sediment away. And the river will get lower and lower and lower, and it will cut down and down and down, deeper and deeper. Okay. So we see the formation of Zion Canyon and the tributary canyons occurring within the last 6 million years. All right, so we had a lot of great questions about rivers and water and erosion. So let me go over those. So the first one, we saw a little bit of this pattern at Kolob Terrace Road. If you're watching this and you went to Snow Canyon, we saw this pattern everywhere in Snow Canyon. So how are checkerboard mesas formed? Does this checkerboard pattern affect the erosion process to be faster or slower? So if we look at checkerboard mesa, this is in Zion National Park, we get, okay, just look at it. Do you see patterns? Do you see lines that form a repeating pattern? Okay, the answer to that is, of course, yes. And we can kind of split this pattern into two different sets or types. So we first off have these sort of runnel or crack features that go up and down. Okay. And then, so that's set one. So we have a set of vertical lines. Our second set of lines are the slightly sloped lines that are crossing the vertical lines. And that's what gives us the checkerboard pattern, right? So this is these patterns are the result of both fracturing history and depositional history. So to start off, we have these slanted lines. Those slanted lines are actually the result of dune deposition. So when dunes deposit, they actually deposit on a slight slope and they build outward along that slope. So that's what we're seeing with the slope lines. The vertical lines, those are the result of fracturing of the rock. So if you went to Snow Canyon, you know that the Navajo sandstone is very porous and permeable. So water can infiltrate into the rock. And when it's cold, when it's at freezing, that water that infiltrates in, that seeps into the rock, will actually freeze and expand and cause the rock to break apart. So these vertical lines, these fractures, are the result of this freeze-thaw cycle. And we're seeing it breaking the rock apart and basically splitting and causing that pattern where we have subhorizontal and vertical lines intersecting. Okay, and yes, that freeze-thaw breaks the rock apart. It can accelerate the erosional process of the Navajo Formation. Okay, so now we have a few questions about lakes and rivers. So in the museum, there was a poster with a picture of Utah during the different geologic ages. On that poster, it mentioned that the Great Salt Lake was a remnant of Lake Bonneville. How did that lake form? All right, so Lake Bonneville. It is a topic that comes up in geology all the time. I was just at an outreach event where elementary kids and their parents came, and I had some marine fossils, and I pointed out to the kids that these fossils were found in Utah. So that means Utah was underwater. And the parent quickly said, yeah, that was Lake Bonneville, right? And I quickly said, no, that was not Lake Bonneville. That was when Utah was actually under the ocean 500 million years ago. The reason I was quick to make that distinction is because Lake Bonneville, we have an image of it here. You can see first off, it didn't cover all of Utah. And second, Lake Bonneville was a very, 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 very recent geologic event. compared to the rest of Utah's geologic history. So Lake Bonneville was in Utah from about 20,000 to 15,000 years ago. If you think of our timeline, that might as well have been yesterday. Okay. It is not it is a significant part of the recent story, but big picture and long term, it's just a little blip. Okay. So Lake Bonneville was the result of the most recent ice age. The glaciers ended up melting, and all of that meltwater collected within the downdropped valleys of the basin and range. So we didn't just have Lake Bonneville, there were also other large lakes throughout Nevada as well. As the glaciers melted, these lakes filled higher and higher and higher until eventually one part of the lake breached a natural levee. And as it started to flow over, the energy increased at that location and it started to incise down and allowed for the water to basically drain out into Idaho and Oregon. So that occurred at this Red Rock Pass right here. This was kind of the lowest elevation finding the outside edge of this lake. And as soon as the level was high enough, it breached that natural pass, water started to escape, and the water started to drain. And basically what we're left with today, combined with that draining and also with the climate changing to become more arid, we have the Great Salt Lake and we have Sevier Lake. Those are the remnants of Lake Bonneville. So basically the Great Salt Lake is Lake Bonneville. It's just not as big. Okay, next couple questions. If Quail Lake is important for the area's water supply, why did they build Sand Hollow? Okay, how will Quail Lake and other man-made lakes affect the geology of the region in the future? And then with the Virgin River being such a major force in the St. George area, what is its source? So I have a map that shows the water resources of our field trip area. So here we have Quail Creek. So Quail Creek is the result of, or Quail Creek Reservoir is the result of building a dam to block off Quail Creek itself, so the water collects there. If you look at Sand Hollow, do you see any rivers or streams flowing into Sand Hollow? The answer is no. So Sand Hollow is kind of funny. So they actually put a dam about right here on the Virgin River, but instead of allowing the water to collect into a reservoir, all this dam does is it diverts the water in a pipeline that goes into Sand Hollow. So there is an underground buried pipeline that basically fills Sand Hollow Reservoir. So why do we have two of them? Well, it's because we need more water. So one would not be sufficient for the water needs of the St. George region. So we have two. What will be the effect on the geologic record? With every dam, once again, you are changing the energy of the depositional system. So a flowing river is higher energy than a lake. So what happens is any sediment being transmitted by that stream or by that river, it will end up slowing down, stopping, and depositing. So all of these reservoirs will eventually completely fill with sediment. Now, this is a process that takes not that long on a geologic timescale, but fairly long on a human timescale. It could take thousands of years, but eventually, if we just keep these dams here, these reservoirs will completely fill with sediment. And if it's full of sediment, it's kind of worthless as a water collection reservoir. So that last question, what is the source for the Virgin River? So the Virgin River is the major river of Southwest Utah. And the river actually originates up on Cedar Mountain on the Markagant Plateau at a place called Navajo Lake. It's actually really, really cool. So we have Navajo Lake on Cedar Mountain. The water from that lake actually flows underground through caverns. where it spills out of a hole in the cliff called Cascade Falls and goes down this steep slope into Zion Canyon. So maybe you've heard a lot about how all the snow we're having is good, because that snow is where the water for all of these rivers comes from. Okay, if we don't have snow on the mountains, these rivers don't have water in them. And the more snow we have, the more steady and higher these streams flow for us to collect and utilize the water as a natural resource. All right, our last step, recent volcanism. So here we see a cinder cone just above Snow Canyon. This is actually not the Veo cone that we saw at Snow Canyon. This one is a little bit closer to Snow Canyon, so there are multiple cinder cones. On the last field trip to Hurricane, we saw 2 cinder cones there. There's another cinder cone that led to the lava rock that we parked on at our first stop on Kolob Terrace Road. So basically there are cinder cones all over the freaking place in southern Utah. And most of these cinder cones are very geologically recent. So within the last 2 million years, with the most recent being about 20,000 years ago. So why do we have all of this volcanic activity? Well, this actually relates to the tectonic setting. Currently, we are in the basin and range tectonic setting, so the region is being stretched apart. As the region is being stretched apart, what that is doing is that is releasing the pressure on the lithosphere, and that actually allows for melting to occur more easily. Okay, so anywhere we have divergent systems, if you remember from our tectonic lectures, anywhere you have plates moving apart, there are always volcanoes that are forming in between. And these volcanoes are almost always mafic in composition. So they'll produce basalt and they'll produce cinder cones. Okay, so that's what we're seeing there. So if you're looking at this, you might be thinking 20,000 years, that is very, very recent. Is this region still considered volcanically active? And the answer is it is considered volcanically dormant. If you go up Cedar Mountain, you'll see some lava flows. The USGS is actually monitoring that area for volcanic activity because those flows are so recent. So it is possible for there to be volcanic activity in southern Utah in the future. Very, very possible. All right, that leads to our last question. Could an old volcano, a cinder cone, ever become active again in the future? And the answer to that is probably not. So the specific cinder cones that we encountered, those are basically one-time events. So I have these two words, monogenetic versus polygenetic. So some volcanoes are monogenetic, meaning they result and occur during a single eruption. Whereas other volcanoes are polygenetic, meaning that they can produce multiple eruptions. And cinder cones themselves are considered monogenetic. So it's a one-time thing. It erupts once and then it's done. However, as I mentioned, this region is considered volcanically dormant. So it is possible for new cinder cones to develop in areas around existing cinder cones. And that's something that the Utah Geologic Survey is monitoring. They're looking for regions that might be uplifting or have increased earthquakes or seismicity to determine whether a new volcanic event will form. Right now, southern Utah is considered very, very low risk. So it's not a major concern compared to other regions that are moderate risk, such as some of the Cascade Mountain Range or the Yellowstone hotspot. All right, so thank you for your questions. Hopefully you appreciate me doing this now. I think that was, once again, a lot of information, but it should help you kind of consolidate in your minds and just help you kind of put things together, put the whole story together. This story, keep it in mind. I'm telling you a story about a geologic area. this is the same sort of thing that you're going to be doing with your course projects. So you can definitely use this slideshow and this video as a model for how to think about the geologic development of a specific area, about your specific parks. All right, so thank you for listening. If you made it this far, you are definitely my favorite student. I know I did a lot of talking, but I appreciate you listening. And yeah, I'll see you later.